But we wanted to move to another very important story, another story that's flying under the radar, and that's the ongoing sanctions. I think this is 25 years. I could be wrong. Our guest will tell us, against the country of Zimbabwe. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Rutendo Matinyarare, who is the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions movement and the founder of Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War Sanctions. Rutendo, thank you so much for being with us. If you could just explain, what sanctions are on Zimbabwe and what's the effect that they're having?
Well, thank you so much. First of all, we've got congressional sanctions on Zimbabwe. The congressional sanctions are tailored to ensure that Zimbabwe cannot get loans from multilateral lending institution. More importantly, cannot get cancellation of debt. And why this is so important is the fact that when we got our independence after fighting a protracted war for 17 years, we had what was called the Lancaster House Conference. What that was essentially was the British forcing the liberation fighters into a negotiation process so that they would not defeat the settlers that were settled on the land who were being defeated in the war. So the British government, the American government, they jump in. That's after they had been sponsoring 15,000 mercenaries to actually stop the independence of Zimbabwe. So we negotiate this independence negotiation. It says we can't take land for the first 10 years, but more critically, it says that we will not pay reparations, but we will give you ability to borrow money from multilateral lending institutions to rebuild, reconstruct the country from the colonization, from the exploitation. And if you use your own money to rebuild the country, then you can actually get cancellation of debt after a certain period of time. So as you would know, Zimbabwe created the best education system in Africa over a 20-year period. We had to build 5,700 schools. But within that period, we spent so much money that we actually had to go through a structural adjustment program. So now when we get to about 1999, 2000, we start wanting to get debt cancellation because the debt was just a bit too much. And what actually caused Zimbabwe's debt to actually grow out of proportion was the fact that we had to fight a war against apartheid South Africa, who were sabotaging Zimbabwe, sabotaging the entire SADC region in order for apartheid to remain. And that's where we took about 60% of our current debt. Now, Zidera comes in, Congress says, we can't get cancellation of debts. We can't get new debts to build new schools. And immediately this puts Zimbabwe in a debt trap. And we're still in that debt trap now. These sanctions were supposed to ensure that Mugabe does not get elected again in 2002 elections. Zimbabweans re-elected him because he was undertaking land reform. He was giving land back to Zimbabweans. And so the United States President, George Bush, decided that this time he was actually going to institute what are called executive order sanctions on Zimbabweans. These executive order sanctions were tailored now to cripple industry, to cripple the manufacturing, to cripple the farming, and to ensure that we do not get loans. Our banks cannot lend those people that were undertaking land reform, and the new farmers on the land could not get with the government of Zimbabwe. So they were actually comprehensive sanctions. They called them targeted sanctions. But as you can hear, those are not targeted. They're on the government of Zimbabwe. And we are the people that then went to the government to say, you've got to go to the UN, get the UN involved, get the UN to declare these sanctions illegal and to also declare them violations against humanity. But we actually feel that they're crimes against humanity because they persecute the Zimbabwean people. And I think Rainer has spoken about this enough times that people know what it is that happens with sanctions. They are weapons, and they are weapons that are found to be illegal by the Geneva Convention.
I wanted to ask, before we kind of continue with the topic of sanctions, you mentioned the issue that drove the U.S. under Bush to declare these kinds of sanctions was the issue of land reform. Can you expand a little bit on what you mean by land reform in Zimbabwe, and what did that land reform do in improving the quality of life of people who live there?
Thank you so much. So when we went for this 17-year war from 1963 over to 1980 when we get our independence, and then we're forced to have these negotiations on how it is that power was going to be transferred, we were actually fighting, or our liberation fighters were fighting for land. They were fighting for land, one man, one vote, and the right to actually participate in the economy equally, and the right to be educated and to get good jobs. So we get our independence. The independence agreement obviously is very influenced by the British, the Americans, the Europeans. I like to call them the Berlin Conference cabal, the same people that colonized us, same people that created the 1454 law of discovery. They colonized all non-white countries. And so they're the same people that sat to be able to decide on how it is that we get our independence. So as a compromise, the Zimbabweans, there were UN sanctions on Rhodesia. And I always say that the UN sanctions on Rhodesia were proposed by the British and the Americans to ensure the deindustrialization of this country called Rhodesia, or the colonial country, so that when the new country comes in, is deindustrialized, cannot produce its own oil, cannot process its own petroleum products, so that it would be forced to negotiate and to be dependent on the Western countries for oil, for US dollars, for loans, and everything else. That's also why they didn't pay reparations. So part of the agreement was the white farmers or the settler farmers would remain with their land. The land would not be immediately returned to black Zimbabweans. And then the government of Zimbabwe would buy land from white farmers in what was called willing buyer, willing seller. In this willing buyer, willing seller, the Zimbabwean government would have to buy the land in foreign currency. The land would have to be valued by real estate agencies that belonged to the very same settlers. So the land would always be expensive. And then 50% of the money after the government is paid, its 50% would come from the European powers who would then top up. So land was expensive. We could not resettle all the people we wanted. So 3 million hectares is taken in the first 10 years. Those 3 million hectares are sent through to 71,000 families. Now, each family would be on average 8 people to 10 people. Then the government had reached in this agreement that was called the Lancaster-House Agreement, an agreement to say, once we get to 10 years, the moratorium is over. You can now take land by creating laws in the new constitution that determines how you take your land. So the Zimbabwean government says, we're now going to take land. They create a new Land Appropriation Act. And in this Land Appropriation Act, they now say that government would value the land. They would then give letters to the farmers and then pay them in local currency. The British were not happy. The Americans were not happy because they didn't want the land to return to the Zimbabwean people. What they wanted is a broke government that could not afford that land, that would then be begging for money from the Europeans, who would then deny them the money. So there were negotiations from 1990, when this new law was created, all the way to 1997. Tony Blair comes in. Tony Blair says, listen here, I'm not the government that made this agreement with you. My government has no obligation to give you land, so we are not going to give you back the land. Mugabe said, that's fine. The land was always ours. We were going to take it, but we were going to require you to pay your settlers, your children. But now that you've decided that you're not going to pay them, we are going to take land and give it back to our people. And so within that period, there was a negotiation process, what was called the Land Conference, held in Harare, to try and see if the donors in the Western world could find a settlement or an agreement. But Mugabe was saying, you can't renegotiate the terms of the Lancaster House Conference that saw us suffering for 10 years, unable to take land for 10 years, and now you want to change the rules and create a new agreement. If you can't honor this one, what would make you honor a new one? And another thing that you need to note, South Africa was negotiating its independence between 1989 and 1994. So the South Africans asked Mugabe to say, please, stop taking land, stop appropriating this land that belongs to black people, because then this might make the South African settlers, the apartheid government, not want to negotiate. So Mugabe held out for about 6 years for South Africa to get independence and to write its constitution, after which then he decided to negotiate with the Blair government about taking back land. Of course, the Blair government refused, and immediately, what many people don't understand is Mugabe didn't necessarily make a policy to say, let's start taking land. The war veterans, the people that had gone to war, had waited for 17 years, were just tired, and they decided, we're not waiting anymore. We're going to invade the land, and if you send soldiers or police to take us off our land, then we're going to go to war with our government. And this was not going to work with the government, so he decided to let those people take the land. Now, what has been the benefit? The benefit has been that we have seen black people, black farmers, growing up the experience curve, doing it without money, learning how to farm, and now they're producing more tobacco than they've ever produced before. Not that I support the growing of commercial crops, but they have learned how to farm. They're producing this year more wheat than we've ever produced before, that we've actually got a surplus of about 60,000 tons. and we're going to be exporting some of that wheat. We've also had surpluses in maize. And even though there's negative publicity in the media, which I believe propaganda goes hand in hand with the fight that we're undertaking, as you were saying about the Ukraine scenario, is that we're seeing young black farmers, young black millionaires, young millionaires that are found in fuel, telecommunications, agriculture. And agriculture is the driver of the entire economy. So there are definitely lots of benefits. The Americans are not happy with that, hence the sanctions. And they're trying to tighten these sanctions in many ways. But Zimbabwe has had one advantage. We've had an educated human capital that has gone all over the world. So while they close up our industry, we have many remittances that are being remitted back to Zimbabwe, reinvested into the economy, particularly agriculture and mining, and also other indigenous areas of business like tourism, construction. And hence we're having quite a boom in Zimbabwe, and it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world at the moment, under sanctions, and the Americans are not happy about that.
Well, I can certainly see why they might not be happy bucking their agenda, but no, I really appreciate that context, which is crucial. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the late Sam Moyo did fantastic work on revealing some of the successes of land reform. But one of the things I want to also ask you about is it feels like there is, at least certainly in the African continent, a lot of momentum around the idea of lifting the sanctions. Certainly, we had the Anti-Sanctions Day of the SADC countries last week. I believe you all are taking some action in court. So talk a little bit about this, because it does feel that there's something of a groundswell coming out, at least the southern half of the continent, around really making something happen on this issue.
Yes, there's a lot that is happening, and we're proud to say that we were central to the writing and the drafting of the new strategy that is being utilized by the government. We had realized that Venezuela played a very strategic role in reversing the sentiment that was beginning to grow when the Americans were trying to invade Venezuela. As the people were united, they became united, they began to speak with one voice. And I have to say, Ms. Kalek was very, very instrumental in that revolution. And what that did is it taught us that we need to unite our people too. We need to start demystifying sanctions, understanding sanctions, telling our people about sanctions, and telling our neighbors so that we get solidarity. And once we get solidarity, one of the central tenets that we were telling our government is you need to go multilateral. You've got to go back to the UN. You've got to go to the World Trade Organization, because the rules in these institutions were created by the very same Americans and the West who are not following these world rules, these international rules, yet they're the ones that wrote these rules and forced African countries to follow them. So we need to hold them accountable to the same laws that they created. And so in 2001, what they wanted to do is the pressure of sanctions was already building. So their intention was to remove sanctions and then to blacklist Zimbabwe through the Financial Action Task Force for money laundering. And the reason they'll do that is they know that once they block normal channels of finance, you have to use alternative channels. And within using those alternative channels, they're then going to flag you for money laundering and so-called financing of terrorism. And so what we did is, when we were grey-listed, we wrote a document to the Minister of Justice explaining to the Minister of Justice that the strategy was to remove sanctions because they were beginning to show that the West and the Americans were breaking international law, but then they would use these anti-money laundering laws, which are equally unjust because they do not come with due process. They just say a nation is breaking money laundering laws, and then they blacklist that nation, take it away from the financial system without any trials and without any due process. So we warned our Minister of Justice that this was what was going to happen. So this multi-pronged strategy, talking to the Zimbabwean people, talking to the neighbors and leaders within the region, talking to the AU, going to the UN, all coalesced to start creating a question on the legality of sanctions. And so now the UN came in, they did an impact assessment, they realized that there was no impact assessment done by the Americans over 21 years. That's a violation of even sanctions imposed by the UN. More importantly, they realized that these sanctions were unilateral. They didn't involve the UN. There was no due process. No one was tried, but people were just punished collectively without trial, which is a violation of the human rights, Bill of Rights. And so we began to press to say, if the UN has given us these weapons, we now need to go into the courts and test this in the courts. So our biggest trading partner is South Africa. And so that means that all transactions, majority of our transactions, majority of our banking, majority of our international trade is done with South Africa. And South African banks were implementing illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe. Now, the UN Human Rights Council has got a resolution called 3413. It says that the implementation of sanctions is illegal. More importantly, you implementing sanctions on behalf, as a third party, on behalf of sanctioned sender is also illegal. So we decided that we are going to go after the South African banks that are denying Zimbabweans accounts, loans, corresponding banking relationships, or transfer of US dollar notes to Zimbabwe, and they're doing it without trial. So that is against the South African constitution that does not allow punishment without trial. And we believe that if we get a ruling from this, if we get a declaratory order that stops South African banks from doing this, that ruling is going to touch on software companies, going to touch on machinery manufacturers, tool manufacturers, any other company in South Africa from implementing the sanctions. But here's where the magic is. The South African constitution is considered one of the best in the world. And it's done so deliberately by the United States because they use South Africa as their launchpad into Africa to control Africa. So we say if their outpost can say that these sanctions are illegal, then every other country in the world that respects the South African constitution, that utilizes it as a springboard into controlling Africa, will have to do the same. So that means the Americans themselves, their banks, have got to accept the same ruling. And the ruling is expected to be in our favor because we've already got a bank called CBZ. CBZ broke US sanctions 15,500 times. They refused to impose sanctions. They took the sanctions list and all people on the sanctions list, they gave them bank accounts and allowed them to transact. The Americans were not happy. So they penalized CBZ, $380 million US. CBZ went, got one of the biggest law firms in the world and decided to resist this penalty. The United States was unable to convince CBZ to pay this penalty because their sanctions are illegal, they're unenforceable. So they had to cancel their penalty, so to speak. That's another international precedent. And that international precedence, together with our international precedents, gives us weapons to go to the international community, particularly businesses, and say, listen, you cannot impose sanctions or enforce sanctions on Zimbabwe or implement sanctions on Zimbabwe because the rulings say the sanctions are illegal, they are unenforceable. So it's illegal for you to enforce the same sanctions. If they refuse to take heed, then we can go for damages. We can penalize them for damages. We can penalize them for continuing to exert an illegality upon the Zimbabwean people without trial, without court orders.
Wow. Well, this is a critical front, and I think the worldwide struggle against sanctions, and very, very interesting. We will continue to watch this and keep updated on it. Rutendo Matinyarare from the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show and helping illuminate some of this.
Thank you so much, and I want to say thank you for you guys. You've been fighting this anti-sanctions fight. You've made it a worldwide issue. You've shown the illegality. You've shown the fact that it's a weapon of hegemony. And I'd like to thank you for the work that you guys have done. We wouldn't be here without guys like you. You've made it an international movement, and I appreciate it so much.
Right on. Thank you, brother. We appreciate you.
Thank you.